tall adjustment here. There we go. No worries. Mercy embraces those who trust in the Lord. Be glad, you righteous, and rejoice in the Lord. Shout for joy, all who are true of heart. Please be seated. It's the fourth Sunday in Lent in year C, so it's time to talk about the parable of the prodigal son, or the responsible or resentful older brother, or the loving parent. Regardless of what title we might give, it's one of the greatest hits among Jesus' many parables, possibly because of its insights into family systems that are just a tad more universal than stories about the perils of landowning or farming. If we've spent any time in the Christian church, we've heard many sermons about this parable, framing it from the context of a repentant sinner or a person of steadfast faith, or as an invitation to consider that we may be called to model the Father's joyful and generous spirit. As a younger sibling approaching this text, I was all geared up to air my grievances about growing up under the shadow of this parable, constantly reminded by my responsible older sibling that it's the younger sibling who gives in to their selfish spirit and runs off to fritter away their inheritance on profligate living. My children's Bible had some excellent illustrations of the younger sibling's downfall, from selfish greed to immoderate spending, and finally to gnawing hunger and jealousy of a pig's dinner. I mean, sometimes I just wanted an extra serving of dessert, but point taken, sister mine, it's a slippery slope from taking too much dessert to becoming a social pariah. I was so ready to preach that sermon, you guys. But this week, as I pondered these readings and worked through what I might have to say about them, I realized that a different part of the story kept pulling my attention. I am probably not the only parent who has struggled during the pandemic with finding the balance between giving my kids enough space to develop their independent sense of self, while still providing proactive support whenever I see them floundering, as their social support systems and routines have been disrupted. As a parent, part of my job is to help them learn how to navigate through life on their own, but they are still adolescents, and they don't have sufficient context to know when feelings of sadness are getting too pervasive, or even how to identify and process their complex feelings. For Joe and me, the months of increasing worry in the spring and summer of 2020 were some of the toughest we've encountered in our almost 13 years of parenting, especially because we were dealing with the same disruptions, though we had the benefit of time and a fully developed prefrontal cortex. I will always regret how long it took us to notice that the girls were struggling. But we were lucky. We were lucky enough not to be personally or financially devastated by illness or loss of income. Very lucky. And we eventually figured out how to monitor our kids so that when it seemed like they needed a little extra support, maybe an extra hug or a one-on-one conversation, or eventually a referral to a counselor specializing in adolescent mental health, we could do our best to provide it. We are not perfect parents, but we keep trying. In this morning's parable, we have a story of a younger son who goes to his father and requests an early disbursement of his share of the inheritance that he would receive upon his father's death. In the story, the father doesn't blink or question the request. He just gives the younger son the money, like that sort of request is totally normal. The younger son, upon receiving the chunk of money that is no longer tied to the family business, leaves the family home within a few days and immediately starts spending the money like there's no tomorrow, which is not a good sign, you guys. Soon, the money is gone, leaving the younger son vulnerable to a famine, and he ends up in a desperate situation. Meanwhile, the older brother has apparently just been working on the family estate, which must have taken quite a financial hit when the father liquidated a significant share of its value. And the years of hard work, made harder by the terrible choices of his family members, result in the brother resenting his siblings' assumed freedom from hard work and worry. I assume he also resents his father, like just a little bit. So I'm coming at this parable after a few years of unrelenting worry about my kids' well-being. But the thing I can't get past is the father's benevolent disregard for his children. When the younger son comes to him and asks for his inheritance money up front, which is a bonkers thing to do, even in our day, and would have been crazy back in Jesus' time, the father just gives it to him, perhaps so offended by what the request implies, that instead of asking the son why he wants it or needs it, he's like, here's your money, go with God. It's no wonder that the younger son leaves within a few days, perhaps not out of mere selfishness, as I'd always been taught, but because there wasn't a place for him in a family system that was so indifferent to his apparent distress. Time passes, and it's unclear whether the father immediately begins to miss his son and regret the choices that drove him away, or if he suddenly becomes aware of his grief at the suspension of that relationship when he sees his lost son walking down the road towards the home. Either way, when he sees his child, he springs into action, giving him a hug and clothes and shoes and food to eat, all things that loving parents strive to give their children. And he calls everyone to join in a celebration at the son's restoration to the family relationship. The father is still not a perfect parent. He neglects to anticipate his older child's feelings of displacement and resentment, but he is starting to become a better parent. In the past, I have tended to consider this story's moment of grace, the good news, if you will, to be found in the father's joyful welcome of his wayward child, in the son's unearned second chance at inclusion in the family. But right now, I am finding a whole boatload of grace in the father getting a second chance at practicing real loving care for his sons. One of the best things about the parables as a teaching method is that they are so malleable, enabling us to drop in from different perspectives to gain a deeper understanding of what the scripture is saying to us today, to gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and where we fit into the good news. Throughout my life in the church, I have heard a lot of allegorical readings of this parable, with the younger son playing the part of all the wayward sinners who have left the path, those sinners whom Jesus welcomed. The older brother playing the part of the faithful Christians who have kept up their work in the fields, despite the temptation to cash in and go have some fun, those grumbling Pharisees and scribes. And the father playing the role of God, who welcomes back every wandering soul and celebrates their restored relationship. And that's fine. But I find that I'm a little wary of allegory, to paraphrase Tolkien, and I wonder if we might find a little more meaning in the story if we allow ourselves to consider the ways in which we embody each role in the parable, from the messed up, impetuous younger brother to the steady, resentful older brother, to the father who learns the importance of celebrating every moment with his loved ones. The past few years have been traumatic, and they have disrupted so many lives and relationships. I'm sure that all of us have had cause to be deeply concerned for our family members, friends, fellow parishioners, fellow humans. Maybe we've done as good a job as we could to love them, but maybe we've occasionally been too caught up in our own cycles of grief and fear to practice love. But if we learn any lesson from the parable of the prodigal son, it's that whatever we have done or left undone, whatever we have tried, and however we may have failed to follow Jesus, there is always grace extended to us to try again, that we may be ever moving towards becoming the righteousness of God. We are a little more than halfway through our penitential journey in Lent, which may sometimes feel like being lost in the wilderness of self-doubt or challenging relationships. But the purpose of this journey is ultimately to move toward reconciliation, toward a closer relationship with God, and through that relationship and grounded in love, to draw closer to each other, to care and love one another in times of rejoicing and in times of grief, to become a new creation. Thanks be to God.